After 60 years of marriage, Eleanor's deathbed confession shatters James's understanding of their love story, revealing a secret that changes everything about how their life together began, and what it truly means to love someone beyond their secrets. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. James Harrison sat beside the hospital bed, his weathered hand gently holding his wife's pale, fragile fingers. At 85, his once strong frame had diminished, but his eyes still held the same kindness and determination that had carried him through decades of struggle. Eleanor Harrison, 83, lay against the stark white sheets, her breathing labored but steady. Even now, with her silver hair splayed across the pillow and her face lined with age, James could see the beautiful young woman he'd fallen in love with 60 years ago. Their daughter, Michelle, stood at the window, staring out at the city below. At 55, she was the perfect blend of her parents, her father's strength and her mother's grace. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital room as the family waited in silence for the doctor's return. "James," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of the monitors. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." James leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "What is it, Ellie? You can tell me anything. You know that." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Not this. I've kept it hidden for too long, but I can't. I can't leave this world without you knowing the truth." Michelle turned from the window, concern etched across her face. "Mom, maybe you should rest. The doctor said I don't have much time," Eleanor interrupted, a sudden firmness in her voice. "And there are things that need to be said before I go." James felt a chill run down his spine, a premonition of something momentous approaching. After 60 years of marriage, he thought they had shared everything. What secret could be so terrible that Eleanor had kept it hidden? All this time? They had met in 1965 during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. James often thought back to that day in the small university library where Eleanor sat alone, poring over her books. He had been drawn to her immediately, not just by her beauty, but by the intensity in her eyes as she studied. When he approached her table and asked if he could join her, she had looked up, startled not by his boldness, but by the genuine interest in his voice. "It wasn't easy," James now told Michelle as they sat in the hospital cafeteria hours later, Eleanor having fallen into a fitful sleep upstairs. "Back then, people didn't accept couples like us. Your mother's family disowned her. My community was suspicious. We received threats, lost friends. But we had each other. And eventually, we had you." Michelle nodded, having heard these stories throughout her childhood. "But Dad, in all those years, did you ever suspect Mom was keeping something from you? Something big?" James stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl as he considered the question. "Your mother and I have always been honest with each other. At least I thought we were. The truth was, there had been moments, fleeting instances when Eleanor would become distant, when her eyes would cloud over with something like guilt or fear. James had always attributed it to the stress of their situation, the constant struggle, to be accepted in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. The early years were the hardest, James continued, lost in recollection. "We had nothing but love and determination. I was working 2 jobs. Your mother was finishing her degree. We lived in that tiny apartment on Maple Street, remember? The one with the leaky roof and the noisy neighbors." Michelle smiled at the memory. "I remember. You used to tell me it was our castle." "And it was," James said firmly. "Because we were together. Because we were building something that nobody thought would last." By the time Michelle was born in 1970, James and Eleanor had moved to a slightly larger apartment in a marginally better neighborhood. James had secured a position as a high school history teacher, while Eleanor worked part-time as a librarian. They weren't wealthy by any measure, but they had created a stable home filled with books, music, and love. The outside world, however, remained hostile. Parents complained about having James teach their children. Eleanor's colleagues maintained a cool distance. When they walked down the street together, they faced stares, whispers, and occasionally outright hostility. "Do you remember Mrs. Jenkins from down the hall?" James asked Michelle as they returned to Eleanor's hospital room that evening. Michelle chuckled. "The one who brought us casseroles every Sunday for a year?" "That's the one. When we first moved, and she wouldn't even look at us. Then one day her son got into trouble at school, and I stayed late to help him with his homework. After that, she couldn't do enough for our family. One by one, they had won people over. Not through confrontation, but through quiet dignity and persistent kindness. James had become a beloved teacher, eventually rising to the position of principal. Eleanor had transformed the community library into a vibrant center for learning and connection. Together, they had raised Michelle to be proud of her heritage and confident in her identity. "We built a good life," James said softly as they watched Eleanor sleep. "Whatever this secret is, it can't change that." But as the night deepened and Michelle went home to her own family, James sat alone with his thoughts and his fears. What could Eleanor possibly have to tell him that was so important, so terrible, that she had kept it hidden for 60 years? Next morning, Eleanor seemed stronger. The doctor had adjusted her medication, and her eyes were clearer than they had been in days. When Michelle left to get breakfast, Eleanor gestured for James to come closer. "James," she began, her voice steady despite her frailty, "do you remember the day we met?" James smiled. "Of course I do. April 15th, 1965. You were wearing a blue dress, and you had your hair pulled back with a white ribbon." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "You always remembered the details. That's one of the things I've always loved about you." She took a deep breath. "But there's something about that day, something about me, that you don't know." James waited, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "I didn't meet you by chance," Eleanor continued. "I sought you out. I had seen you around campus, heard you speak at a rally. I admired your courage, your conviction, and I wanted to be part of it." James furrowed his brow, confused. "What are you saying, Ellie?" Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. "My family wasn't just against our relationship because of prejudice, James. They were actively working against everything you stood for. My father was a prominent member of organizations that sought to maintain segregation. His money-funded campaigns against civil rights legislation. Our family name was respected in circles that despised everything you represented." James sat back, stunned. He had known Eleanor's family was conservative, that they had old money and traditional values. But this? "I fell in love with you for real, James. That part was never a lie," Eleanor hurried on. "But at first, I approached you because I wanted to rebel, to hurt my father. I was young and angry and thought I could use you to make a statement." James felt a coldness spreading through his chest. "So our relationship began as what? An act of rebellion? A political statement?" Eleanor shook her head fiercely. "It began that way, perhaps for a week or two. But then I truly got to know you. I saw your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. I fell in love with you so completely that I could barely remember the person I had been before." "Why are you telling me this now?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because there's more," Eleanor replied, her face contorted with the effort of continuing. "My father didn't just disown me when we got married. He threatened me. He said he would ruin you, destroy your career, maybe even have you harmed if I didn't come back home." James's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I made a deal with him," Eleanor said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I told him I would never reveal the family's connections to those hate groups, never speak about the things I knew they had done. In return, he would leave us alone, let us live our lives. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on James's shoulders. All these years, Eleanor had been carrying this burden alone, protecting him from a threat he hadn't even known existed. But that's not all, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping even lower. The money that helped us buy our first house? The unexpected inheritance I received after my mother died? It wasn't from a distant aunt like I told you. It was from my father. He kept sending money anonymously throughout his life. James stood up abruptly, pacing the small hospital room. So, our life together, the home we built, the life we made, it was funded by the very people who hated what we stood for? Not all of it, Eleanor pleaded. Just the beginning, just enough to give us a foundation when times were hardest. Everything else we earned ourselves. For 3 days, James wandered through a labyrinth of emotions, each one more complex than the last. He spent countless hours pacing the sterile hospital corridors, his footsteps echoing through the halls as his mind raced with questions. The revelation had struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him disoriented and struggling to make sense of his 6-decade relationship with the woman he thought he knew completely. In the small hospital chapel, he sat alone in the dim light, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened, searching for guidance in a place he hadn't sought solace in years. Michelle became his confidant during these turbulent days, listening, as he vacillated between anger and understanding, betrayal and compassion. "I feel like I'm grieving twice," he confessed to her as they shared a quiet lunch in the hospital garden. "I'm losing your mother to this illness, but I've also lost the narrative of our marriage, the story I've told myself all these years." Michelle reached across the table to take his hand. "Maybe it's not about losing a story, Dad. Maybe it's about gaining a truer one. Mom didn't tell you because she was trying to protect what you had built together." James contemplated his daughter's words, watching a pair of sparrows flit between the branches of a nearby tree. "Protection and deception look remarkably similar, sometimes," he said after a long pause. "That's what makes this so difficult." At night, in the quiet of his empty home, the home he and Eleanor had shared for 40 years, James found himself moving from room to room, examining the photographs that chronicled their life together. He paused before a black-and-white wedding photo, studying Eleanor's young face for signs of deception or uncertainty. Instead, he saw only joy and determination. In their bedroom, he opened her jewelry box and found the small sapphire earrings he had given her on their 5th anniversary when they could barely afford such luxuries. Had those been purchased with her father's blood money? Or had they, as he remembered, saved for months to afford them? On the 3rd night, he came across a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon tucked away in the back of Eleanor's desk drawer. They were love letters he had written to her during a brief separation early in their relationship, when he had taken a teaching position in another city. With trembling hands, he unfolded one dated October 1966. "My dearest Ellie," he had written. "Today I stood before a classroom of 27 students and spoke about the concept of courage. I told them about historical figures who had stood up for what was right against overwhelming opposition. But as I spoke, I was thinking of you. Your courage in choosing our love over the comfortable life you could have had astounds me daily. I am humbled by your sacrifice and strengthened by your devotion." James wept then, for the first time since Eleanor's confession. Not out of anger or betrayal, but from a profound realization that the truth of their love transcended its complicated beginnings. Eleanor's choice to stay with him, to build a life with him despite having an escape route always available, represented a deeper commitment than he had ever fully comprehended. Dawn was breaking on the 4th day when James finally reached a place of clarity. He showered, dressed with care in the tweed jacket Eleanor had always loved, and drove to the hospital with a sense of purpose that had been missing since her revelation. Outside her room, he paused to gather his thoughts, watching through the small window as a nurse checked Eleanor's vital signs. She looked so fragile now, diminished in ways that tore at his heart. Rain pattered softly against the hospital windows as James entered the room, creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to slow time itself. Eleanor was awake, her gaze immediately finding his, filled with a mixture of hope and fear that made her look vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen during their strong partnership. The rain outside cast shifting patterns of light across her bed, a kaleidoscope of shadows dancing across the sheets. "I've been thinking," James said, pulling a chair close to her bedside and taking her hand in his. Her skin felt like tissue, paper beneath his fingers, so delicate he feared it might tear. "About what you told me, about our life together." Eleanor waited, barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow movements. The weight of anticipation hung between them, like a physical presence. "At first I felt betrayed," James admitted, his voice low and measured. "I thought about all the times you could have told me, should have told me. I wondered what else might not be true." He watched as pain flickered across her features, but he needed to speak his truth before he could offer forgiveness. "I questioned everything, every memory, every moment of happiness. I wondered if our entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies." He paused, swallowing hard against the emotion rising in his throat. "I even went through your desk last night looking for, I don't know what I was looking for. More secrets, perhaps." Eleanor closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lids, tracking silent paths down her hollowed cheeks. James reached out with his free hand to gently wipe them away, the gesture as familiar as breathing after 60 years together. "But then I found my old letters to you," he continued, his voice softening. "And I read what I had written about your courage, your sacrifice. And something clicked into place for me, Ellie." She opened her eyes, a fragile hope beginning to kindle. "In their depths. The beginning of our story isn't what matters most. It's everything that came after," James said with growing conviction. "It's 60 years of waking up beside you every morning. It's raising our daughter together. It's facing discrimination and hardship, and never once letting it break us. It's the thousands of small kindnesses, the shared jokes that no one else would understand. The way you've always known when to push me and when to let me be." The room seemed to grow brighter as he spoke, as if the weight of secrets long carried was lifting, allowing light to filter through. Outside, the rain began to ease, sunshine breaking through the clouds in golden shafts. "I realized something else, too," James continued, leaning forward in his chair. "Your father may have thought he was controlling our lives with his money, but in reality we transformed what that money meant. We used it to create something beautiful and true, something he could never have imagined or approved of." He leaned closer, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead, inhaling the familiar scent of her that had been muted by hospital antiseptic but was still undeniably Eleanor. "You might have approached me for the wrong reasons, Ellie, but you stayed for all the right ones. And the money, well, there's a certain poetry to using funds from people who wanted to keep us apart to help build our life together." Eleanor's fingers tightened weakly around his. "You're not angry?" she whispered, her voice small but hopeful. "I was," James admitted, meeting her gaze directly. "I won't deny that, but anger takes too much energy, and we don't have time for it. What we did, what we built together, was revolutionary, regardless of how it began, and perhaps even more so, knowing what I know now." He shifted his position to sit on the edge of her bed, needing to be closer to her. "Do you remember what you said to me on our 25th anniversary, when I asked you if you had any regrets?" A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. I said that regrets were luxury items we couldn't afford. James nodded, his own smile mirroring hers. And you were right. Looking back now, I see that what we created was so rare, so precious, that the circumstances of its beginning pale in comparison to what it became. The door opened quietly, and Michelle entered the room, carrying a small photo album bound in faded leather. I found it in the attic last night, she explained, pulling up a chair on the opposite side of Eleanor's bed. I thought we might want to look through it together. She had been collecting pictures from their life together, their wedding day, Michelle's birth, holidays, graduations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by the love that filled them. With gentle care, she opened the album across Eleanor's lap, revealing a black and white photograph of James and Eleanor dancing at their modest wedding reception. "Look at you two," Michelle said softly. "So young and determined." James studied the photograph, seeing it with new eyes now. The defiance in Eleanor's posture, the protective way he had his arm around her waist, it spoke volumes about the challenges they had faced and would continue to face. "We had no idea what we were getting into," he murmured. "But you did it anyway," Michelle replied. "That's what courage looks like." They turned the pages slowly, each photograph a chapter in their shared history. Here was James holding newborn Michelle, his expression a mixture of terror and adoration. Here was Eleanor receiving her master's degree, James and 10-year-old, Michelle beaming with pride beside her. Here they were at the opening of the community center they had helped establish, cutting a red ribbon as local news cameras flashed. As they looked through the photos together, Eleanor's breathing became more labored. The doctor had warned them that it wouldn't be long now. James exchanged a glance with Michelle, both of them recognizing the signs they had been prepared for, but could never truly be ready to face. "I have one last question," James said softly, closing the photo album and setting it aside. He took both of Eleanor's hands in his, leaning close so she wouldn't have to strain to hear him. "In all our years together, all the struggles and triumphs, all the joy and pain, was it worth it? Turning your back on your family, living with this secret?" Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes suddenly bright and clear as if the approaching threshold of death had burned away all pretense and hesitation. "Every moment," she whispered, each word deliberate and full of conviction. "Every single moment was worth it. You and Michelle are the best things that ever happened to me. My only regret is not telling you the truth sooner." James nodded, understanding at last the complex mixture of fear and love that had guided Eleanor's choices. "Some secrets are kept out of fear, others out of love. I think yours was a bit of both." He stroked her hair gently, the silver strands like silk between his fingers. "And I understand now why you kept it. You were trying to protect what we had built?" "I was afraid," Eleanor admitted, her voice fading. "Afraid that knowing the truth would taint everything we had, that you would look at our home, our life, and see only the shadow of my father's money." "Never," James assured her. "What we built was ours, completely ours. The foundation might have come from elsewhere, but every brick, every beam, every moment of happiness, those we created together." Michelle moved to sit beside her father, the three of them connected now as they had always been. "Mom, Dad's right. What you two created wasn't just a marriage or a family. It was a testament to what's possible when love is stronger than fear, stronger than prejudice." As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. James remained steadfast at her side, sometimes speaking softly of memories they had shared, sometimes simply holding her hand in comfortable silence. Michelle read aloud from Eleanor's favorite poetry collection, the familiar words washing over them like a gentle tide. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the hospital room. Eleanor rallied briefly, her eyes finding James with surprising clarity. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything," James replied without hesitation. "Remember us as we were, not as how we began." Her voice was barely audible now. "Tell our story, the true story, but make sure people understand that what matters most is what we became together." James felt tears burning in his eyes but did not let them fall. "I promise," he said firmly. "Our love story will be told in full, complicated beginnings and all. But always with the understanding that real love isn't about perfect starts. It's about the journey traveled together." Eleanor smiled then, a smile of such peace and completion that it transformed her face, erasing the lines of pain and worry. Her hand tightened briefly around his, a final communication more eloquent than words. And then, as the last rays of sunlight painted the room in amber hues, Eleanor Harrison passed away peacefully, her hand held tightly in her husband's grasp. The secret that had weighed on her for 60 years had finally been revealed, and in its revelation had come not destruction, but a deeper understanding, an acknowledgement that love is not diminished by imperfect beginnings, but elevated by the choices made every day to nurture and protect it. James Harrison continued to hold his wife's hand long after she was gone, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin, as he had done countless times throughout their marriage. Michelle placed her hand over both of theirs, completing the circle of family that Eleanor had fought so hard to create and preserve. In the days that followed, as they made arrangements and received condolences, James found himself telling friends and family members about Eleanor's courage, not just in defying societal norms to marry him, but in choosing love over privilege, in turning away from a world of comfort and acceptance to build something new and revolutionary with him. She could have had an easier life, he told their oldest friends at the memorial service. But she chose a better one instead. She chose love in all its complexity and challenge. And in doing so, she taught me that love isn't about perfection. It's about growth, forgiveness, and seeing the complete truth of another person and cherishing them anyway. In the end, theirs was not just a story of secrets kept, but of love that persevered. A love that had begun in complicated circumstances but had grown into something pure and unwavering. A love that had, against all odds, lasted a lifetime and would continue to inspire all who heard their story for generations to come.